My nightmares in the hospital were horrifying. They had begun to give me sedation via injection after I refused to take the pills. They told me I needed to sleep, that I was hallucinating. It didn't matter that there were no other explanations for my wounds, the ones that would open up while I slept. I told them my dreams had teeth, but they didn't believe me. When I finally got to sleep, I found myself in the lair of a horrible creature. I saw corpses in varying states of decay laying around me, as well as piles of bones and skulls. There were vials of jars filled with unidentifiable body parts floating in them, stacked on the shelves haphazardly. A figure in a black cloak was toiling over a workbench. When he stood up and walked away for a moment, I saw that there was an array of rusty, dull-looking knives and surgical instruments lined up on that filthy work table. The tall figure walked back to the workbench with a jar of something in his hands and set it down on the table, dipping the instruments into it. I noticed now that I was tied down to a rack, bound by my hands and feet. The rough wood and metal rivets scraped into my back as I shifted, trying to get free, but it was impossible. The bindings holding me were tied fast. "Ah, waking up, are we?" The figure walked over to me with a scalpel in his hand. He held it up as he walked towards me. His face was a mask of evil, eyes black as midnight. He had a long scar running from his right eye all the way down across his nose to his left cheek. He wore a dark cloak and had a golden amulet around his neck. He looked somewhat human, as had the old man in the shack. "I don't want to take the overseer's prize from them, but I will take just a taste." He reached down and began to saw with the dull blade, hacking away at the flesh of my exposed calf. I screamed and tried to twist away, but that had just made him cut deeper. After slicing and sawing with the rusty blade for a while, he pulled away a scrap of my calf, holding it up to the light for inspection. I gagged, trying not to vomit, knowing that if I did, I could choke on my own bile. The disgusting creature licked the scrap of flesh with his impossibly long tongue, tasting it. He sniffed it and licked his lips. He snapped the whole thing up with his long, sharp teeth, eating it rapidly. He looked like a shark eating a sardine. He turned back to me with a hungry look in his eyes and pulled out another blade, this one longer than the last. He began to saw a big hunk of flesh from my left flank. The knife was slightly sharper, and I could feel it going easily through the skin and muscle, shearing it off effortlessly. I wasn't sure which one was better, a dull blade or a sharp blade. With this one, he would just be butchering me more quickly. I fought to wake up, knowing I was dreaming but couldn't do it. The creature sawing away at my side was certainly a distraction. Finally he stopped, satisfied for the moment with the filet mignon-sized portion he had hacked off for himself. I focused with all my energy on waking up from this nightmare. I felt a horrible sharp pain in my chest and cried out. The creature looked up at me with his mouth full, still chewing, and frowned. When I came to, the nurse couldn't believe her eyes. She had been trying to wake me up, pushing with her knuckles against the bony prominence of my sternum with all her body weight. She began to cry, saying she hadn't thought it was possible. The sheets were covered with blood, as were the myriad of fresh dressings she had just applied a few hours earlier to the complex wounds which covered me from head to toe. The machine next to me, which displayed my vital signs, was blaring and whooping alarmingly, and I saw several other nurses and a couple doctors entering the room, pulling out stethoscopes and calling for units of blood to be ordered. I looked at my blood pressure and noticed it read 72/43 on the machine next to me. My heart rate was climbing dangerously high into the 150s. I had learned to read the monitor over the last couple of weeks in the hospital. I was still in the step-down unit under close observation, but I was getting the sinking feeling that I was headed back to the ICU. The nurse was crying and saying she didn't understand. She just couldn't understand. Someone had to usher her out of the room. I tried not to scream at them. I had told them this would happen. The doctors asked me questions and I responded appropriately, tired of being told I was crazy. I managed to remember the exact date and my floor and room number, stumping them when they started down that line of questioning. My wrists and ankles were strapped tightly to the bed still, so they knew I hadn't done the damage to myself. My side and calf were on fire, and I looked down, unsurprised to see large pieces missing, blood spurting from traumatically interrupted arteries. I wondered how the doctors would try to explain this one. They always spoke with such calm, smug self-assurance. It was vindicating to see their flabbergasted faces. "What could have caused this?" One of the younger doctors asked a senior a few minutes after she came in. She looked at me in dismay and shook her head, sweat instantly beading on her forehead as she went a shade paler. They were applying pressure dressings to my wounds and talking about getting me into the OR. Their voices were shaky and they looked at me nervously with sideways glances, afraid to make eye contact with the freak. I felt like a well-crafted prop for a horror movie with some serious production value as the blood squirted suddenly higher and a younger nurse passed out. I began to realize that we needed to escape the hospital. Lester had told me the only way to get back to the gateway was to use the same trick that he had used that night, what felt like a lifetime ago. When I got out of the OR and was allowed to use my phone again, I texted Lester, and we planned our escape. He had come to the same realization. The doctors refused to believe the plain truth that when we slept, we were being eaten alive by creatures from another dimension. We were being butchered by our nightmares. I understand it's a hard thing to get your head around, but the evidence was plain to see. All it took was watching the HD footage of me getting pieces sawn off by phantom knives and fingers dismembered by invisible teeth. But doctors are a stubborn bunch. We waited a few more days until my wounds had stopped actively bleeding. The surgeons had done a bang-up job removing flaps of skin from my thighs and patching missing chunks from my calf and love handle. They had used some sort of space-age mesh filler material to replace the gaping holes that had been left. The dressings were holding up well and no longer needed to be changed as frequently, only once a day. I grabbed a few extra packages of bandages from the corner of the room where the nurses stashed their extra supplies and threw them in my backpack. The nurses on the floor knew we were friends and that we were both night owls. They allowed us an hour off ward at a time to go downstairs for coffee now that our wounds were healing. We waited until the nursing station was quiet and abandoned in the middle of the night and snuck out. The nurses would assume we had gone down for coffee or fresh air if they found our rooms empty, and we both drink a lot of coffee. We walked straight out the front door wearing only our street clothes. Our only stop once we were out of the hospital was the drugstore where Lester bought 6 large bottles of cough syrup. It was time to close that fucking gateway once and for all.